The winds of change are blowing in the UK. Before the events that took place in late July and early August 2024, when news of the Southport killings first broke out in the news, I was shocked, yet at the same time I wasn't shocked. I remember reading the details of the crime. It's a really sick crime. Of course, it's not as though we haven't had crimes like this before. We had plenty of knife spree killings before in the past, like just the year before, or was it a couple of years before? I forget exactly when. We had the Nottingham stabbing spree, which was done by an illegal immigrant. And going back before that, we had the London Bridge killings, the Manchester Arena bombings, the killing of Lee Rigby. We've had so many killings over the years that I've just gradually sort of become numb to them, where each time we had the same old formula, rinse and repeat, where some innocent people are killed, the Prime Minister gives a speech where they pretend to be shocked and surprised, and we have this big performative outbreak of spontaneous charity, hashtag not all Muslims, hashtag refugees welcome, and all that. And the far right are demonized as evil criminals, etc., etc. But this time was different. Last year, it's really hard to say. I did not think that we would have an outbreak of rioting after the Southport killings, because honestly, the riots that happened last year, in my opinion, were 10 years overdue. I would have thought that after the shocking murder of drummer Lee Rigby, back in, I think it was 2012 or 2013, I forget exactly what year, I would have thought that in itself would have been enough to rouse the angry masses into open revolt against the government. It was especially symbolic that an off-duty soldier wearing uniform be butchered in the street and decapitated by these two criminal foreigners. Technically they were born here, but I don't consider them British at all, and let's be honest, I don't think even they did. But it's really strange how over the past 10 years, something has definitely changed in the psyche of the British people. Whatever magic spell the powers that be were able to cast on us to keep us mesmerized and entranced, reciting that multicultural mantra to just, keep calm and not look back in anger. For some reason, that all disappeared in late July and early August of 2024. And we can speculate all day long as to what may have been the tipping point that led to this. Why this one event was the last straw that broke the camel's back. There's plenty of panelists and politicos who've given nuanced technical opinions on why the Southport attack was different to the rest. I mean, first of all the victims, we've had plenty of knife spree killings before, as I said, it wasn't the first, but all the victims in this case were young children, young girls. But that in itself isn't unique, because the same could have also been said back in 2017 for the Manchester Arena bombings. That one incident had more victims, and lots of them were young teenagers at the Ariana Grande concert. And you would think, if we're to judge each spree killing that we've had at the hands of Muslim extremists or illegal criminal immigrants, or legal immigrants, or British people who are definitely British, that's what they call themselves. If we're to judge each merits of the case in terms of their death toll and how young the victims were and how shocking each was, this one doesn't even top the rest at some of the ones that we've had in the past. But for some reason, the British people just lost their minds over this. I could scarcely believe the reports when I was seeing all the news footage of the riots. First they started in Southport, but then it spread to other areas like, I think, Merseyside, Liverpool. I think there were riots in Manchester, basically all over the north, but not just the north. It happened in some southern place. I think there were riots in, what's the name of that place? Was it Aldershot or Brookwood? I'm going to have to double check that. But yeah, no, some of the rioting actually happened not far from where I live. It's, something was definitely in the air that day. There has been what I can only describe as a vibe shift. I think it's interesting to contemplate what is different now compared to how things were back in the early 2010s when we first started experiencing this. But there are lots of things, there are lots of sort of conditions present now that weren't present back then, which may have in some way contributed to the riots that happened last year. I mean, let's try going over the obvious. Well, first of all, mass immigration was obviously nothing new in the 2010s because we started getting mass immigration in the late 90s. It carried throughout the 2000s, the noughties. But obviously, the rate by which we were receiving immigrants, you know, the net inflow of migration, even though it was high back then, it was still only a fraction compared to how it would later be, because it's just been increasing linearly upwards like this on an almost logarithmic scale. We're getting seven figures worth of immigrants into this country, and those are just the legal ones. In the late 2010s, I think starting around 2018, 2019, we then started getting the boat migrant people illegally. And the government's done fuck all about those people as well. And we know that those people coming in aren't refugees. They're not even women and children, and they're being funded in taxpayer-funded accommodation. Some of them are being hosed in luxury cruises and 5-star hotels, and we're paying for that. This wasn't happening even going back so far as 2012. Certainly not before that. What else has changed? Well, of course, there's the hyperinflation that took place around 2020, back when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor for the Exchequer. Rishi Sunak, he ruined the economy before he was even Prime Minister. Now that takes some degree of talent to completely fuck over your economy before getting elected. Oh, I'm kidding. The guy wasn't even elected anyway, but I mean, technicalities, right? So yeah, no, and the inflation hit this country so bad. I mean, even I felt it, because there's a breakfast diner down the road from where I live that sells really good food. And there's a 5-item breakfast you can get there currently for £7.60. But I remember just 5 years ago, just a couple of years ago before the pandemic, when you could get it for less than £5. Think about that. That's I think you could get 5 items for £4.80 or £5. So that's basically that's a nearly 50% increase in price. Jeez, I remember when you could order a pint of Guinness at your local pub for less than £4. But now now the prices of everything has gone up. The cost of living's gone up. So these conditions weren't in place even so far back as the 2010s. So there's definitely something in the air now. Also another important thing that I feel ought to be considered is, back in the early 2000s, most people still had faith in the pillars of society, the institutions, the police, the media, the politicians, and all that, and the education system. Now, if you were to calmly, logically, and rationally observe what was happening, because, you know, the facts and figures were all on the books, the writing was on the wall back then, if you were perceptive enough to see it. There was mass immigration coming into this country since the late 90s. It was having a noticeable effect on the cultural and the visual landscape, but it only happened in working class areas. In big cities like London, Leeds, Manchester, Bradford, and so on. It's actually been happening even before that, but the numbers were nothing like what they were back then. However, back then, most people believed that politicians were still accountable to the public. Most people believed that the media was unbiased. Like, yeah, the media was biased, so they thought, but the media is, you know, it's the pride of Britain. The BBC tells us the truth. We pay it with our taxpayer money, so all our views are represented. Right wing or left wing, it doesn't matter. And if you'd come out with a view that the BBC is pro-mass immigration, all politicians are basically in favor of mass immigration, there's plenty of options that are just simply not up for debate, people wouldn't have taken you seriously back then. They'd have looked at you like you're from another planet. And I remember having conversations like this with my mum and dad. And they've been watching traditional mainstream legacy media news for decades, back in a time where, comparatively speaking, yeah, there was more diversity of views represented back then in journalism, certainly compared to nowadays. So everyone back then had a hard time believing that our government, the powers that be, the current dispensation, was engaged in a top-down conspiracy to force us to endure mass immigration from all different parts of the world, and to gaslight us into thinking that A, this was normal, B, this is something we wanted, even if it's not a choice we were given at the ballot box, and C, it's necessary for the economy, and D, these people are just as British as us, so what? Are you a racist? Are you a fascist for not wanting this? I think this is something that, if you're not old enough to remember what life was like in the 2000s and the early 2010s, you know, before 2014, which is sort of when the shit really began to hit the fan, you know, with the Alexis J report and all that. I think this is what people fail to understand, because the world was a very different place back then. This was a time where being racist, yeah, it's funny to think how nowadays, you know, people outcompete each other to be as edgy as possible. You know, Twitter is full of rampant hatred towards minorities and Indians, and I freaking love it. I love racist jokes and racist humor, and I'm a bit racist myself, and I wouldn't say I hate people of different races, but yeah, I have a huge problem with people of different groups, and I don't think there's a problem with that, considering the context of the world and the culture we live in now. But back then, back in the 2000s, you know, this is the kind of thing that you could not even joke about. I got into trouble at school simply for saying things that were racially insensitive to a black student at my school who was bullying me. I just made fun of him. I mean, I didn't really understand the implication of what I was saying. You know, I said he was a black tribesman, and I called him a black blighter. Don't ask why I called him that. I was very young. I didn't really understand what I was doing, what I was saying. But I got into so much trouble for that. They put the fear of God in me that I came close to getting expelled. And this was the time of the Macpherson inquiry, back when everyone suddenly decided the police are racist. We need to fill our police force with unqualified black, Asian, Pakistanis and Indians, even though they're like less than 1% of our population. We need to do this everywhere. We need to have these unaccountable ethnic token minorities everywhere to show that we're not racist. And this was the time of Tommy Robinson. Tommy Robinson first started making the headlines in the EDL in the late 2000s, the early 2010s, and we were all invited to point the finger, laugh at them and hate them because they were evil racists. And same thing with Nick Griffin and the BNP. If you want to understand what the contemporary social zeitgeist was like in the 2000s, just go on YouTube and type in Nick Griffin BBC Question Time. Just look at how hostile the whole audience was to him. Nobody, not one person would give the man a fair hearing. Everyone was trying to impeach him based on his views on the Holocaust. And like, okay, we have plenty of evidence that the Holocaust happened, but are we really going to ban people from questioning it or having their own views? Like, why is that a crime? The truth does not mind being questioned, but lies, they hate being questioned. Anyway, I'm not saying the Holocaust did or didn't happen. You know, I've no problem accepting that it did, although I do have an issue with the way it's being taught to us in our schools and how every political discussion we have always reverts back to that. But anyway, that's getting beside the point. The world back in the 2000s and the 2010s, the early 2010s especially, it's such a distant time compared to nowadays. So I feel like the conditions that would have needed to have been in place for this outbreak of rioting to have occurred, which seemed to have been a spontaneous outpouring of anger, mainly directed, I think, towards the police and the government, but also towards Muslims. I'm not necessarily saying I condone what happened last year, but this would have been unthinkable back in the early 2000s. We hadn't had high-profile race riots from whites against minorities since the 1950s with the Notting Hill riots. And if you watched any crap by Channel 4, ITV News or BBC about the history of race relations, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the stench of fascism, it lurks everywhere, and the Notting Hill riots were always in a hair's breadth of happening again, and we need to constantly be vigilant. They've been stoking up the fears of leftists everywhere, reminding us that these racist, hateful, far-right outbreaks of thuggery and all that, you can never keep it down. We gotta step in and prevent it. Nobody ever talks about the fact there was plenty of rioting by minorities against us that happened in the past few decades. No one seems to have talked about it, like in the Oldham riots in the late 90s and early 2000s. It was done by Pakistanis against us, against white Mancunian, against white people from Oldham. Or the Brixton riots, it was done by blacks in London because black people were getting searched and patted by the police because they kept on committing crimes, and the police were holding them to a standard of behavior, the same standard of behavior they did to whites, but blacks were getting stopped and searched more because they committed more crimes. A trend that continues to be replicated even now. But anyway, blacks did what they usually did. They chimped out and they caused so much destruction. I think, to my knowledge, it was the first ever outbreak of civil disturbance in the UK to involve Molotov cocktails. And after that, the police decided, there was a report called the Scarman Report that decided from now on we're not going to publish crime statistics insofar as race and ethnicity is concerned, because we don't want to risk anything like this happening again. And then a decade later, there was the Macpherson Report. I don't know if any of you have heard about this, but I remember hearing about it at school. There was a black teenager who got stabbed to death in London. Have you ever heard anything like that happen before in your life? A black man getting stabbed in a city. It's like I could feel everyone's heart stop. Everyone watching this video, I could feel the sound of your heart missing a beat, because you've probably never heard this story once in your life. Everyone knows black people don't get stabbed in big cities. It's not a thing that happens. You've a better chance of finding a bird with human teeth than you have. I'm not being serious, obviously. Black people getting stabbed in large cities, it's known to happen. And honestly, the more you read about the case, the more you understand there's really nothing about the Stephen Lawrence killing that makes it memorable, or certainly not worthy of our attention. There's no evidence. Honestly, it's just a gang killing. But in this case, the guys who stabbed him were all white men. They were all white, thugs, lower class thugs. They stabbed him for some gang-related territorial dispute, and one of them called him the N-word, a nigger. This is my channel. I've got to give out my honest thoughts, so I can't be afraid of using naughty words like that. Anyway, that's what they called him. And the police, to be fair, they were kind of incompetent. There's a lot of procedural errors and mistakes they made. But that doesn't mean that the whole system needed an overhaul, where we could just point the finger and say, you're all racist. We need to get rid of all these seasoned veteran police officers and replace them with these black women and gays and Indians and Asians. Like, the fuck did they have to do with any of this? But it was a different time. This was the late 90s. This was Britain before mass immigration and mass globalization and all that had scarred our cultural landscape. So most people probably didn't think anything like this was even possible. And regrettably, those people who were around back then in the late 90s, it's been nearly 40 years. No, it's been 30 years since then. Nearly 30 years since the Macpherson report. And those people probably still think that we're living in the same Britain now that they lived in back then. But the world has changed, thanks to them and their stupid ideas. The media is not trustworthy. We can question as to whether it ever was. But the media always presents a one-sided, biased narrative sequence of events whenever it covers stories like the riots and the history of mass immigration. They've lied to our faces, and up until recently, up until the last decade, nobody thought it was possible that the media could lie so brazenly, that they could gaslight us over and over again. We thought that our media, our government, our police, our politicians, we thought they were all unimpeachable back then. And that, in my opinion, is why the Southport riots could not have happened 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago. But things are different now. Because the riots, you got to understand, they happened mainly in northern working class areas. They happened in northern areas which were heavily hit hard. They were really hit hard by globalization. A lot of these northern towns, they used to have, the beating hearts of these northern communities used to be the hubs of industrial centers of industry and production, which don't exist anymore. They used to be coke ovens, what are they called? Factories. There used to be mines, but all those things disappeared. All those people out there have been left high and dry by Thatcherism and then by Blairism. We import coal and manufactured goods from China and anywhere else in the world so we can get it cheaper. Meanwhile, these people who had communities and generations of their families working in the beating heart of their local town, the place that gave them meaning, as well as a means of living, well, all that's been taken away from them. And there's been just decades upon decades of poverty, misery, and crime. These people have not been, they've not had their views represented at the ballot box. And for some shocking reason, up until fairly recently, they were able to tolerate it. Like, we were able to ignore them for so long. But then came along the 2020s. The year 2020, the pandemic hit. And then we've just been having year after year of successive mass high-profile stabbings and killings by foreign criminals who had no right to be here, or who by some clandestine technicality, by some unfair ruling by a judge that was not made without the consultation of any of the people who lived here, they're ruled to be as British as us. And over time, I think this must have lit the fuse to result in the powder keg, the explosion that is what we saw just last year. I was originally going to talk about Keir Starmer and how he addressed the Southport trial that's currently ongoing, but I've already spent nearly half an hour talking about this. I've got to finish my collection, and I should probably take a moment to rehearse my facts of the case, rehearse my understanding of the case, the facts as they currently are. I should probably take a moment to find out what the current reporting restrictions are, because I certainly don't want to get my arse landed in jail because Keir Starmer's a bloody nutter tyrant who doesn't want people telling the truth. But anyway, I would stop short of saying that I condone the rioting and the violence. Obviously, if things were in ideal circumstances, the riots would never have happened. They should not ever have happened. But the government is 100% responsible for the riots that happened. They forced all this on. They tore these northern communities apart. They stole away their jobs. They completely eviscerated and tore apart their families and communities. They took everything away from them. They left them in the dirt and dust. They tried replacing them with cheap foreign labor. And they made the mistake of thinking that the working class townspeople would sit and deal with it. And that's a strategy that may have worked in the past, but no longer. Because the thing about working class people is that they're very proud. They don't have a great deal of material possessions. All they've got is their pride and their roots. And they're tough. And when they want to protest, when they're unhappy about things, they're never quiet. And if we're to prevent stuff like this from happening in the future, we would do well to listen to and address their concerns. Because otherwise, this is not the last we're going to be hearing about riots. I guarantee there's only going to be more if we continue to repeat the mistakes that have been made for the past 2 decades. Anyway, I'll see you guys later.